All right, today it's my pleasure to talk with Luis Sanchez, and Luis and I have known each other for, I'd say, about a year and a half. I think it was April of 2019 or so that we had a leadership meeting at church, and we talked about bringing you in as a church planner, and that may be confusing to some people. They may not know what that means, so I'll let you touch on that later if you want to. But anyway, Luis is he's working through Smokey Point Community Church, and he's going to be planting a church called Church for the Nations, which I think is a timely name at these times. So anyway, Luis, it's been a lot of fun getting to know you. I wish we got a chance to spend a little more time together. But we're touching on race and what's going on in our country. And I'd like to just start out with you giving kind of some of your background, like what is your story? And then how has race played a role in that?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me on here, Dan. I love the concept of these conversations, to listen, to learn, to love, and then to kind of do something about it, leadership-wise. My name is Luis Sanchez, like Dan said, and I am a first-generation American. Came here when I was 5. I crossed actually the border illegally as a 5-year-old with my dad. And that has a lot to do with my experience as an American, right? I grew up on Long Island. I'm from New York. So I would consider myself a native New Yorker. I've only actually been back to Ecuador once since I've left, and I was on a missions trip when I was in college. And I grew up in a part of the world, Long Island, that is still to this very day one of the most racially segregated places in our entire country. You wouldn't think about it because people think of New York as a place that is pretty progressive. But a lot of what dictates where people live has to do with money and policy. And if you look at, people talk about following the money. If you look at, the resources and where they're allocated and where people live, and how school lines are drawn, particularly in a place. And I just want to preface today's conversation by saying, hey, what I'm saying comes from my own lived experience. I don't speak for every other first-generation American or every other Latino male in society. So I'm coming to you from this first-person narrative, this first-person perspective through my lived experiences. And so in New York, I just grew up living in a world that is in some ways pretty Black, white, and Hispanic. And the lines were drawn pretty clearly. And so, I grew up in a Latino neighborhood, immigrant neighborhood that was Black and Hispanic. We had tons of people, as you can imagine, in New York. Multiculturalism is a thing. Diversity is a big thing. I mean, you can't really run away from it. And mostly we were living next to each other because of socioeconomic reasons, right? Everyone trying to make it ahead. And again, it goes back to resources and the money. But I had an excellent childhood, as I can recall. I think we didn't know any better, but everybody around us was struggling, and everybody around us was looking, to make the American dream. And I grew up going to church. I grew up on a swim team that was a predominantly Black swim team. One of my that experience really shaped my life. For 15, 16 years of my life, my primary male role model outside of my dad and the pastor at my church was a Black man who was my swim coach. And that's the context that I grew up in Hempstead on Long Island. For most of my childhood and into even my teenage years, coach is what we called him, Robert Trotman, was the guy that, in our community that was kind of like just the man that we all looked to, and in some ways wanted to be like, and we took on his mannerisms and did all of that. For better or for worse. Coach was sometimes a hothead too. He was one of the very first Black coaches in the USA swimming circuit, out of Harlem, then Brooklyn, and then ultimately Hempstead, where our paths crossed. And I was a lifeguard for them and the team. And later, even in college, I swam for the team that that the Trotman family ran for the City University of New York in Queens. So I grew up in a pretty, again, diverse world, but also seeing from a very early age the socioeconomic disparities in the world that I lived in. And then when I was in 10th grade, I got a scholarship to a school on the North Shore of Long Island, which was a Quaker school. And it was completely different. We were like a fish out of water. I was like the first one in my family to go. Tuition in those days, in the early 2000s, was like $35,000 a year for day school. And it was a college prep school, and it was wild. My entire life changed. When I went there, it was an hour away from my home. It was in, if you've ever read or seen the movie The Great Gatsby, the setting of The Great Gatsby, I think they call it the North Egg. That's the setting of that is the North Shore, where I ended up going to school, and it was full of opulence and very, very different than the environment that I grew up in on the South Shore of Long Island, where I was around immigrant folks and Black folks, beautiful folks, but the experience was very different, and so that shaped my worldview. Seeing those disparities. So for most of my time, for the remainder of high school, I ended up living there, and so it wasn't sleepaway school or a boarding school, but many nights I wouldn't come home. So I ended up living on the North Shore, staying with friends, because it just the commute was a lot. And my parents would pick me up, and they were great about it. The reason why I ended up at that school is because my parents, in their mind, had it fixed that education was the only way out, right? Like and so this was literally the best school on Long Island, like 2 with another school down the road called Portledge. These independent schools that, many of my friends went on to Ivy Leagues, and they're doing amazing things. Some of you might know some of them, and it's just really, really cool things. But I had my feet in both worlds that were very, very different. And so on one side, there was a lot of privilege being a, light-skinned, white-passing Hispanic that eventually learned to speak proper English, right, or whatever that is, right? And so in my community where I grew up in Hempstead, I was generally regarded, really, really well and respected among the community and in leadership roles and in my church and all these other things, a lot of it due to me having this foot in this other world. But in the other world, it was a crab at the bottom of this bucket. There was no competition, not even close, with I went to school with the folks who owned the Knicks, the New York Knicks, and the Rangers, and the vice president of Viacom that owned MTV and all these other things, like their kids, and it was wild. And yeah, so I was just this other kid, from the Out of the Hood program at the other school, and so I experienced, in many ways, racism, classism, a bunch of isms on the other side. But I mean, it's made me the person that I am today, and it's kind of opened my eyes to where I'm at, and kind of shaped, my personal worldview, and in many ways, it's just allowed me to, in moments like these, kind of be able to see things from multiple angles, and in some ways try to be a bridge and kind of speak truth, even, in some places where it hurts. So sometimes when I'm around, white folks, I'll say something and they'll be like, give me the side eye. And sometimes when I'm with color, I'll say something and then they'll give me the side eye. And so, but I think that's okay, an equal opportunity disruptor, and say, well, what about this, or what about this, or have you seen it from this angle? I still think that what's just is just, and what's right is right, and what's wrong is wrong, and having those conversations are important. So that kind of, yeah.
Right. Fascinating. So I would say you definitely experienced privilege, where you ended up going to school, top 1 or 2 school in the state. Not many people get that. And so there's the phrase out there, white privilege. Obviously, it wasn't everybody white at your school, but you saw a lot of privilege. What are your thoughts on the concept of white privilege, and maybe with the lens that you got to experience coming from, the hood, where there just wasn't as many opportunities, and thoughts on that?
Yeah. So when you think about the word white privilege, I have a couple of thoughts. I've been thinking about this for a little bit. I think there's no denying that white privilege is a thing. I sometimes have a problem with the vocabulary, just because right off the bat, I can see how it can turn people off right away. And like, there's no, like after that, then there's no conversation to be had. As a concept, I get it, some people think that, hey, so for example, I have some friends who are white and who don't have money, right? Who struggled, who moved year after year, who went to 12 different schools, who, and these are people that I know here from the state of Washington, where I currently live. And it's a bit offensive to say to them, hey, but I think what folks miss when they get offended right away at the term is that it's not that, hey, you, the way I understand the term, that your life is, that you always had it good, right? That white privilege means that just because you're white, you're automatically going to have it good. And as I understand the term, is white privilege means that as a white person, or you do not start off at the same place as other people, as people of color. For example, as a person who, the life of a white person isn't bad because they're white, or they don't experience certain hardships because they're white, right? White folks may experience hardships because of, family issues, or because of drug issues, or because of poor choices, or because of generational things, people before us making bad choices, and they may experience those, hardships because of other reasons, but not because of the color of their skin. And that's what white privilege denotes. But no matter how much money, no matter how much education, no matter how many accolades a person may have that is a person of color, through much of America, and I want to say that not all of America, but through much of America, and through many of their lived experiences, and I can say that in the first person narrative of my own lived experience, because we are not white, and because just because we're not white, we already have to make up some gaps, whether there are gaps in trust, or whether there are gaps in even a more education or whatever the case may be, right? Have to work twice as hard to, keep the same job that other people get many opportunities for and can be clowning around in, et cetera, et cetera. And so for me, I guess I have an issue with the vocabulary. I still haven't found other vocabulary to replace it. But the idea is that white people don't have a hard time at life because they're white. But people of color, a lot of times, experience hardship just because of the color of their skin, whether it's being pulled over multiple times by police officers in a neighborhood where it doesn't look like they belong, whether it's being followed at in the store, whether it's not being treated or taken seriously at a doctor's office and having to explain or visit multiple doctors to get a proper diagnosis. I was reading, I have a couple of friends in healthcare, and the rate at which the Black mortality among mothers is significantly higher. Black mothers is significantly higher than in the white population. And so we start looking at things like that. It's like, okay, what's happening here? And so that's how I understand white privilege, and maybe a flawed understanding, but that's how I understand it. So
great answer. Thank you. So you mentioned that I'll give you two directions to go on this. You had very hard, fast lines drawn between Black, white, and Hispanic neighborhoods. And then you've also mentioned that you've experienced racism. Would you care to share either an experience that you've directly faced, or what would happen if you tried to cross over those lines? Take one of those two.
I'll take both of those.
All
I'll
right.
tell you what, when I was probably 13 or 14-year-old, when your mom trusts you long enough to leave your house, in my context, I lived, and you can look this up, I live in a town called Hempstead, New York. Right next to my town was another town called Garden City. It's one of the most affluent towns on the South Shore of Long Island. Literally, what looks like projects, the back of the projects face this, other really, really nice town called Garden City. As you drive south from the North Shore into Garden City and then into Hempstead, you see tree-lined streets, liquor store, laundromat, liquor store, restaurant, gas station, liquor store. Like, you could literally see that, and the difference is very clear. There's a canopy of trees, and all of a sudden, no trees. Liquor store, churches, corner store, gas station, liquor store. And that's exactly how it looks. So, I lived around the corner in this building development that my dad used to be a superintendent at. So he's doing maintenance. Had 125 units that my dad used to oversee. And so, we left the hood. We went for literally maybe a 5-minute bike ride, 5-minute bike ride. And we went to the park at Garden City. And we were there probably no more than 10 minutes. The cops showed up, and they're like, yeah, you guys can't be here. Where are you guys from? So we're kids. We don't have ID. We don't have any of that, at 13, but I was probably with a kid who probably was a little darker than me. And the cops showed up. They're like, you guys got to go. What are you going to do? At a 13-year-old, you're going to talk back to a cop? It doesn't happen, And
Wow.
so we ended up having to, we got sent home, and that was my mom actually reminded me of that story a couple of weeks ago, and I was like, that's right. I remember that happening. It must have been traumatic for my mom, right? Like, when I come home and I tell her, hey, the cops just kicked us out of this park, and we were like swinging on the swings. That was like before the time in my life when I started making bad decisions. I made bad decisions later, but in that time I was just being a kid, right? And so that happened one time. And what was the second part of the question?
So the first part was crossing over the lines, and then the other one, and that one kind of answered both, but direct racism that you've encountered.
Yeah. And then the other thing is, and I can't be 100% sure that this was direct racism, But I was at a party on the North Shore of Long Island one time, and this was in high school, and it was a small group of people. We were probably less than 10 of us just hanging out. It was probably like a warm, like spring day. School was still in session. And a laptop and $500 went missing at this party. And it wasn't like a party. It was just a get together of friends. And I was like the one friend that wasn't like they had invited, and I love these people. They're great. This one home had been on the cover of Home and Gardens magazine, and they had a whole spread inside their home, and it was wild. And I was just like walking through the house, I was just flabbergasted just how beautiful the home was. And I wasn't anywhere where I wasn't supposed to be. I was with everyone else, but somehow, somewhere at the end of the evening, like this like $500 and this laptop went missing. And it ended up like everybody was like, it must have been me. And of course it wasn't me. I was just glad to be there. I was out, like it wasn't me, and then it kind of just became this thing where it's like our community was very small. There were 70 people in my graduating class. And so once something like that, it's just insidious. It's like, it gets around, and like people don't trust you. It like messes up your entire reputation. And like, no, it wasn't me, and now as a 36-year-old man, it still wasn't me. I don't have a reason to lie, and I always thought I knew who did it, but that's irrelevant, because once the damage is done, it's done. And so that was another story. And there's other types of stories that I have. I've also been, so to be honest with you too, I've also been the recipient of like privilege because of my fairness, right? In a community where there's a lot of Black and brown folks. And today I'm a little darker than I would be because I've been fishing on the Sound. And but there's one time, and this is kind of like the time period where I was just like, I'd walked away from church. I walked away from Jesus, like getting in trouble. And I was doing the same thing that I was in a group of 4 people. And me and this one girl, she was half Black. I was, Latino. And there were these 2 guys and 2 Black guys that were with us. And we're all friends, and we would all hang out. And we're all like messing up together, right? Like doing the same thing. And the cops show up. 2 patrol cars just kind of like corner us into like this one kind of like L-shaped road, and they take us out of the cars. They ask us a bunch of questions, and we're all doing the same thing. And the guys, the 2 Black guys that are with us, answering the questions, but they're kind of like annoyed, like, what are you doing? Like, just leave us, and I'm sitting there like scared, like I don't have interactions with police, like that at that point, like that was like, but for whatever reason, like they let me and Jessica go, and they take those 2 other guys, and they're like, oh, you have this or that, or, we need to take you back in to the station. And it's like, it just seemed very unfair to me in that moment, that those other 2 guys were treated much differently. So I wanted, for the sake of like being true to my personal lived experience, I have also seen it play where the fairness of my skin has sometimes gotten me off the hook, or thinking, being able to talk my way out of a situation, or, something like that. And so, that's been the case. I mean, I have there's tons of discrimination stories I think I can tell you too. I mean, for example, like on Long Island, the practice of redlining, even though it's outlawed, I don't know if you know that vocabulary, but Levittown is not far from where I grew up. And Levittown is a huge place where redlining was literally legal for many years, where folks would come out of World War II. They built all these kind of cookie cutter homes and developed suburbia. And they wouldn't lend money to people of color, essentially Black folks specifically. There wasn't many Hispanics at the time. And they wouldn't show folks homes. They wouldn't show folks houses in that space. And so I grew up thinking, there's no way I'm going to be able to live in New York in a place other than the ghetto, right? Like, because it just doesn't happen. Because I even worked in real estate for some time, and unless you had like really good representation and you had a lot of money, you probably weren't going to be a person of color living in a predominantly white neighborhood. And it just wasn't going to happen. And this is like in the 2000s and in the 90s. Like, this is like mid 2000s. So and so thinking, like when I got married to my wife, so my wife is a white woman. We have an intercultural marriage, thinking, babe, you need to keep your last name as we try to manage these chips, so that we can offer our children and the best that's around. And unfortunately, that's like something that you have to kind of think about. And even though there's like equal opportunity housing laws and all this other equal opportunity lenders, like those exist for a reason, because wasn't a thing before. And even though it's a thing on paper, it doesn't mean that it's practiced really well. And so even to this day, if you go to Long Island, the lines are drawn pretty clearly. And I'm sure there's been talks about redistribution of and drawing the lines of school differently. But what happens if people have money, they'll just get up and move and go somewhere else, And so it really ultimately, like, this is a heart issue, and it's also a policy issue, but you can't think about it just as a policy issue or just as a heart issue,
Okay, I'm going to come back to that. I want to ask another specific Latino question. I think there's a generalization for a lot of Americans to just assume anybody that's Latino is Mexican, right? Nice. Is that racist? Is it offensive? Is it ignorant? Is it something else? Would you touch on that briefly?
Sure. I think it might, maybe all of the above. I think that a lot of you look at a map, right? You look at a map of the world, and a lot of times the maps that we think of puts the U.S. at the very center of the maps, if you think of it that way. And really, the U.S. is so beautiful, it's so big, it's so grand, that, I mean, you can really experience, the tropics in Florida, the tundra in Alaska, really, the mountains in Denver and in California, and like and so for folks, I'm again not as a white person, I can imagine how it's like this space is just so unique, so central. We don't need anything more, and so there isn't a reason to maybe know about the rest of the world, because this is the world that we know, and this is the world that I need to know about. Growing up, either we were, in my experience, we were Puerto Rican or we were Mexican, because in New York there's a huge Puerto Rican population. But yeah, like, the world is bigger than Puerto Rico and Mexico. I guess there's in the West Coast, most of the people that are Latino that I run into here are Mexican. So in some ways, I don't fault people for that per se, but the world is bigger than Mexico. From time to time, you're going to run into a guy like me from Ecuador. You'll run into a guy from El Salvador, which may be a little bit confusing. But if people just take a look at the world around us, and not just for Latinos, but like there's tons of, like, if you think of the Caribbean, there's people that are, not everyone from the Caribbean is Jamaican, right? You've got people that are Haitian, you got people that are from the Bahamas, you got people from Trinidad and Tobago, you have people from the U.S. Virgin Islands, you have people from all over. Again, geography, all that stuff matters. We're on the West Coast. You look at Mexico, and then you look at the Central American countries, you look at Panama, you look at Colombia, you look at Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, Argentina, Chile, and you go from there. But yeah, part of it is ignorance or willful ignorance. And part of it, I think, in this case, is lack of exposure to other people. So it's an assumption. And assumptions kind of can get us in trouble.
Yeah. Okay, great. I think that's actually a good jumping off point to talk about your vision for the church that you're planning, called Church for the Nations. It's going to be in South Marysville. And what gave you the idea to name it Church for the Nations, and kind of what's your vision there?
Yeah, well, thanks for asking. So we've been involved in the world of church planting since 2008. And church planting is the work of starting a new church. And for us, that means that gathering a community around Jesus and around the Bible, around the scriptures, and getting together to worship, getting together to do community, and getting together to add value to the community that we're in. Church for the Nations has, I feel like the way that we got the name, it goes back to actually the first sermon that I ever preached. The first sermon that I ever preached, I was in youth group at the time, and I sensed, and this is weird and it's going to sound crazy, but I sensed the Lord. I didn't know what to preach. And I sensed the Lord tell me, get in your car and just drive. I drove from Long Island all the way to Manhattan. And I get into Manhattan, and I'm in traffic, obviously, but it's like 9-10 o'clock at night. And there's a church, and I forget what exit I took. And on the sign of the church, it says, "And my house will be a house of prayer for all nations." And it's a reference to Isaiah 56:7. It's not only a reference to Isaiah 56:7, it's a reference to when Jesus overturns the tables and cleanses the temple. And he says, "My house is supposed to be a house of prayer for all nations, and you've turned it into a den of thieves." So from the very beginning, it's been our heart to create a space that is not just diverse, but multicultural, where we appreciate, the full gamut of God's creativity in making man and women, and come from all the places that we've come from, and the beauty that all that brings. As soon as I saw that sign, I felt like the Spirit said, "It's okay, you can go home now." And I literally turned back around. I hadn't even been in Manhattan for that long. I turned back around. I probably had to make a couple of rights, because a lot of one-way streets in Manhattan, or a couple lefts. And then just got back on the highway and went home. And I sensed like, okay, I got my text. And so I got my text, studied Isaiah 56:7. And that's been with me since as long as I can remember. So that probably was 2006. And from the very beginning, I felt like God's called us to the ministry of racial justice. I married into a multicultural marriage. My wife and I are both on board, raised in multicultural children. Melissa is can trace her lineage back to Washington's original spy ring. Her family had a very important role in the American Revolution. They had a bunch of taverns in the Northeast, and the Mercereau brothers. They even have a show about Washington's original spy ring on AMC called Turn. It's run its course now, but it's on Netflix now. And Melissa's family is mentioned in the pilot of that show. Um, and so, yeah, so our work, even before all of this kind of, you know, uh, civil rights movement 2.0 stuff has come up. Um, our heart has been to build a community right here in the greater Seattle area that makes much of Jesus, that looks like heaven. And how do we know that that's true? In the book of Revelation, chapter 7, verse 9, it says that every tongue, tribe, and nation is gathered around the throne of Jesus. And in God's sovereignty and in God's wisdom, when we get to heaven, when we experience eternity forever, we don't lose our cultural distinctives. Every tongue, tribe, and nation is present there. And so I don't know exactly what that's going to work like. I don't know exactly what that's going to look like. But I do know that God isn't into a monocultural expression of the church. And I don't think it's going to be easy. I think it's going to be messy. I think it's going to be hard. But I think if we are spirit-empowered people and people that trust not in our power, but in the power of God, that it's doable, because Jesus asked us to pray the following prayer. He said, on earth as it is in heaven. And so that's our prayer, that we are able to practice on this side of eternity what we believe we will be doing on the next side of eternity, is getting together to worship and to do community around the throne.
Awesome.
So, yeah.
When we finish, if you have resources that you want to send to me, I will attach that in the description for the YouTube link. Make sure you send me, Facebook pages or internet websites for your church as well. Let me ask one more thing about the church in general. I think your vision kind of just explained it, but what do you think the role of the church, not just specifically Church for the Nations, but the Christian church should be during this time with so much racial tension?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think that the church should serve as a place where people can work this kind of thing out on a local level. The church should be a place where people can organize to amplify the voices of those who are on the margins of society. I think the church can be a place where people can be trained and released as holy disruptors. I think of Martin Luther King and the work of the civil rights movement. Today, we look at it as like, oh, Martin Luther King did some really amazing things. But in King's day, he had a lot of pushback, especially from the church. The people that had his back, and they questioned his salvation, they questioned his methods, they questioned, just today I was reading, this is a demonic movement. Some people say that it wasn't from God. And so, obviously 40, 50 years later, we know that Martin Luther King was onto something, and that actually his work is not even finished, that it still continues. And so, make holy mischief, and I think that sometimes people feel like the church is supposed to be this place that peace is supposed to be kept. But if it's false peace, it's not real peace, right? And false peace needs to be disrupted. And if injustice abounds, all over the text, all over the biblical text, love justice, do mercy, walk humbly with your God. Like, what is justice? Just doing the thing that God would do, loving people well. Jesus summarized it: love God with everything you've got, and then love people as yourself, love others as yourself. And so that's what I think the church should be doing.
Awesome. Last thing here. I want to know what gives you the greatest hope moving forward. And then if there's anything else that you want to touch on that you didn't get to touch on, I'll let you address that and close us out.
Yeah, I think the thing that gives me the greatest hope, and it has to give me the greatest hope, is that the world's not over, right? The world's not over. That we need to make a world that's better for the children that are coming after us. I had a conversation with a friend of mine who is a leader in our denomination, and he has been at this work for a really long time, and a lot of times kind of like a voice crying out in the wilderness in the middle of nowhere, no one's listening. And I said to him, kind of just jokingly, I was like, if we can make the world just a little bit less racist than the world that we inherited, I think we'll be doing. And he like stopped me in my tracks. He's like, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. For in his case, for his grandchildren to inherit a world that is more just, and more equitable. That's the driving force, and I know that on this side of eternity, things will never be 100% all right. But our call, I feel like as Christians and as believers and as people, is to just do what we can, right? And just take the bites out of darkness that we can, just be the light in the places that we are in, and God will take care of the rest. If we can make our communities and our tables a little bit more open to having people that are not like us around them, then the conversation advances, the kingdom advances. And so this is the last thing I would say. And just to answer the other last question, like anything else that I would say, I think practically, what does this look like, right? Because there's a lot of ideas and a lot of things being thrown around. And this is what I'm committed to. And then my invitation to anyone else that would listen is, and this is our motto, longer tables, not taller fences. After COVID is done and we're able to gather around tables again, whether that's in 1 month, 2 months, 2 years, whatever it takes, we'll be able to gather again one day. And the reality is, when you have proximity to someone else, you can't really keep hating someone that you've sat with, that you've cried with, that you've realized you have a lot more in common with than you have differences. And so everybody likes food, everybody likes to eat, and there's some really delicious food out there, and I think there's something to breaking bread with other people that kind of makes their defenses come down. And my hope and my prayer is that everyone will find people that they can be safe with, and that they can say stupid stuff around, and that they can ask hard questions to, So that's a really practical thing. And then the second thing is just keep a humble attitude. You don't have to have all the answers. And if you've already made up your mind about this thing, then you've already lost. You're not teachable, and you're not really going to grow in this area. So those are my two practical things.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Bless you, man. Love you.
You too.
Peace.
Yep.